Hi there, everyone. My name is Kate Fullagar. Great. So I'm going to be the chair, or the moderator, I discovered, of this evening's discussion. First, though, I would like to offer my acknowledgement of the country we stand on today and offer my acknowledgement of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community today. I offer my respect to their elders, past and present, and through them to any First Nations people here this evening. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our three speakers tonight, more thoroughly to you, and who are going to come and talk to us about Pacific voyaging in wooden boats over the last 5,000 years, stretching all the way back to the original settlement of the Pacific, stopping off to observe the momentous era of contact between islanders and Europeans, and then launching into the present era, where reenactment endeavours are proceeding apace. First, though, I'll give you the three kind of more thorough introductions of all three of our speakers so you'll know where we're at. In the middle, we have Dame Anne Salmond, a distinguished professor in Māori studies and anthropology at the University of Auckland. Professor Salmond has written a series of prize-winning books about Māori life, European and Pacific voyaging, and cross-cultural encounters in the Pacific, including two of my favourite history books of all time, I must say, The Trial of the Cannibal Dog, which narrated the history of Cook's 3 Pacific voyages, and Aphrodite's Isle, which recounted the European encounter with Tahiti. In 2013, Dame Anne was awarded the Rutherford Medal, New Zealand's top scientific award, and became the New Zealander of the Year. In 2021, she was awarded the Order of New Zealand. At the far end here is Hoturoa Barclay-Kerr, captain of several ocean-going waka. He's been sailing around the Pacific for more than 35 years. He paddles waka, sails waka, teaches waka. Hoturoa lives waka. That comes directly from his own bio. Diving deep into the art form of waka, he is one of the few holders of waka sailing knowledge in Aotearoa. Throughout the years, Hoturoa has encouraged students to look at this kind of knowledge from all aspects: science, technology, astronomy, the arts, and more. These teachings have taken him to many different Indigenous spaces, working with many different ropu, or groups. Hoturoa is an orator on his marae at Kawia, the home of his waka, and the ancient landing and settlement place of his ancestral waka, Ta Inui, captained by his tapuna, or ancestor, also called Hoturoa. And here to my direct left is Michel Tuffery, an Aotearoa, New Zealand-based artist of Samoan, Rarotongan and Tahitian heritage. In his art practice, he plays the role of connector, working in between people and places and focusing a fresh lens on environmental, community, cultural and art historical divides. He exhibits worldwide and has undertaken research and community residences throughout the USA, the UK, Germany, France, India, Australia, Aotearoa, and the Pacific. Many of his prints also grace my own walls at home, I should say. In 2008, Michel was appointed a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit. So I think we can all agree that we have an outstanding panel here with me. So let's get stuck in, and I'm going to get stuck in by turning to a first slide, which might just help prompt our first part of the discussion. Because I want to start at the beginning, with the story of the original settlement of the Pacific by peoples who would later be happy to be called islanders. I know Anne has written on this as an historian, while Hoturoa and Michel both identify their ancestors in the story. So perhaps we might start with some sort of early remarks from Michel and Hoturoa about their version of the story, how they imagine it, how they might tell it to their own family, and then we can turn to Anne, who can tell us about how different historians and scholars and how this story has been kind of retold over the centuries. But Hoturoa, do you want to start us off?
Kia ora, everyone. Mihi ana ki a koutou, ki o tātou me ngā tūpuna o tēnei whenua. I guess, well, I'm really happy to be here to talk about this kind of stuff because when I grew up, I was, I suppose, challenged because I'd hear these stories from my grandparents and granduncles and grandaunties of how my ancestors came from across the ocean on sailing vessels. And then I'd go to school, and then I'd listen to my teachers tell me that my ancestors, by sheer luck, got lost in a storm somewhere and got blown up on the shores of New Zealand. So I grew up in that kind of environment where I learnt that I should listen to my elders a lot more. And so I went through this early stage of my life believing the stories that my elders told me. And as I got older and older, I could see that these great feats of my ancestors had been relegated into a world of myth and legend. And as I got older and understood and looked for the opportunities to go out and learn how to sail canoes and to start sharing time with some of the great navigators that were around when I was younger, then I knew one of our jobs was to actually try and pull these stories from out of the realm of myth and legend and make them into reality. And so that's the kind of stuff that I've been doing. I have a story of my own for my specific ancestors that sailed their waka into kawhia, as Kate mentioned in the introduction. And we have all our stories that talk about the people that came on that vessel, the kinds of things they brought to our land, and then subsequently how they spread and settled. And that's the kind of stuff that makes me who I am. And so I just love. It's not a thing about trying to pretend to be like my ancestors. It's just doing this kind of stuff to say, yeah, it's doable, it's possible. And when people say to me, why do you believe that kind of stuff? These things that talk about your ancestors fishing land up out of the sea and all those kind of things, I can say, I've actually done it. You know, as we've approached land and an island comes up out of the ocean, it's the same kind of metaphor as if you're pulling fish out of the ocean. And so these are the kind of things that I love doing. I love seeing it every time that happens. And I love watching it and going to myself, I'm seeing the same things that these people saw 1,000 years ago.
Fantastic. Michael, do you have similar memories and reflections about what that story means to you and how it kind of entered your life?
I think that story actually started at primary school when I had sent to Thorn school. I had dyslexia and a speech problem. So art's actually just my first language. And my first experience with cookie was when next to Parliament there was a Bowen House, and they had an exhibition of cookie being done over in Hawaii. And all my mates looked at me and said it was your fault. So for me, that's actually when I didn't actually have that sort of experience of where my ancestors came from, because my mum coming from Samoa, and my feeding father, Dennis Tuffery from Taranaki, was Pākehā, and so he was a patent attorney. So I really didn't get that input until accidentally going up to Hawaii. When I was at UH, I was sent down on a field trip down to Tahiti and accidentally ran into my family, my real family. So that's actually where my journey started. But my whole life, I've been brought into this narrative about Cookie and what he had done and his great feats. In the time that I was brought up, there was a lot of racial tension. There was the Dawn Raids. So for me, it was what the narrative was being fed to me. But then this fruition happened. I don't know what's happened. I went to all these different areas that Cookie had been, and then this book appeared. George Nuku threw the book at me and said, "Tuffs, you need to read this." And it was The Trial of the Cannibal Dog. And it was actually the first book I actually completed as a slow reader, but at the same time, I just dove so deep into it that everything started to make sense. So as I was going back to French Polynesia, back through the islands, everything started to fall into place. And there was a reason why I was there. And there was just too many coincidences that were actually happening, going back to Taputawatea, see the whānau there, which I never knew. So how I come back to this space, I knew what my calling was. And so that's actually, for me, I was just so grateful that there was the Oh My book first before that, and then there was the Trial of the Cannibal Dog. And once I started dissecting all the books and looking at the middems and where human contact, the tension, and who was telling the story, and that's actually where I actually just kept feeding my visual appetite.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the Trial of the Cannibal Dog by Anne is ostensibly about Cook's voyages, but really the very vibrant background of that book is to sort of realise that Cook enters an ancient voyaging history. So we might turn to Anne now, and can you sort of, I guess, map out a little bit of this from a slide that you generously gave us, which sort of helps us think about how that, I guess, historians of various ilks have described this epic story.
Well, it's funny how ancestors come into the picture, because I have a grandfather who came from Whitby, and I grew up in Gisborne, which is the first place where the Endeavour landed in New Zealand, and we had Cook was all over the place. The ships were sitting up in the main street on poles. So our ancestors were all featuring in these stories. And then when I went to the university, I started to learn about Te Ao Māori when I was a teenager, and went to the University of Auckland because that's where I could study te reo, actually, the Māori language. And my colleagues there in the anthropology department and my teachers were people who were doing research in archaeology and physical anthropology, in comparative linguistics, and I trained in comparative linguistics myself as well during that time. And so they were responding, and it's a little bit like what Hoturoa was saying. I heard the same stories when I was at school, these ancestors that staggered onto the beach starving and scrabbled their way up, having been driven there by a storm. My colleagues were actually, I think, part of that turn in the story, where they were looking to see how, here's this amazing geographical feature on the face of the planet. 12,000 kilometres across, 10,000 kilometres north to south, Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean, the great feature on the planet. And the story of how that was explored first by human beings, I think it's one of the great stories of human history. And they were doing some of the work that was starting to trace the migration out of the south coast of China, coming from the south coast of China into island Southeast Asia. And recently they've been finding deep-sea fish in excavations there, more than 40,000 years old. So it's a voyaging tradition which was evolving all the way across the Pacific, and then into island Melanesia, Bismarck Archipelago, and then about 3,500 years. The dates keep on changing. They do. All the time, which is really frustrating. You always have to check the latest papers to make sure you're not wrong. But then from there, the evolution of this amazing voyaging, learning how to craft these waka, how to sail them, and how to sail them further and further. So the invention of blue water sailing in our part of the world, in this wonderful ocean of ours, just an entrancing story. And I've been so privileged to work with some of the people that have tried to trace it through archaeological, through DNA, through what they find in the sites, lithic sourcing, pottery, comparative linguistics, looking at the DNA of the animals that travel with people as well as the people themselves. And it's an absolutely extraordinary story, with back migrations and migrations backwards and forwards, and people it's almost like the way we deal with our cars. You get in a vehicle and take off and go to a destination, and people were just travelling like that in these waka, with the absolute confidence of being at home on the ocean.
Yeah, fantastic. We do have some early images of some of the waka that help us think about how that epic these epic journeys have been made. Here's a 17th century Tongan waka from Lao, a canoe. And then we get to a slightly different era. So let me jump, and we will kind of refer a little bit back to this sort of pre-contact era. But the the contact era that we're about to move into, in many ways, has helped researchers or present-day people think about what occurred before contact as well. So if you recall from looking at that map, the migration story pretty much settles down by about 1200 AD or so, what Europeans might call medieval times. And this reasonably settled Pacific world then encounters a new set of wooden boat voyages, this time from people well outside the Pacific Ocean zone. And Europeans became especially active in the Pacific in the latter half of the 18th century. And so here we've been catapulted into, I think this is 1772. This is from an artist. I believe this is Hodges. Yes, this is from Cook's second voyage. But we will actually go back a couple of years to Cook's first voyage, the Endeavour, where we have this interesting sketch, which will spur us into a different type of discussion. So I'm going to get Michael in a minute to tell us who Parkinson was, but I'll just remind you that this is Parkinson's sketch of Tapu Tapu Atea, which is sort of the edge of it, the stonework on the edge of it, which was a marae. Many people consider it to be the most sacred marae in Polynesia, sort of where the voyages then go out of Tahiti archipelago, up north to Hawaii and down to Aotearoa, considered highly sacred by people of the Eastern Pacific at least. But perhaps I'll throw it to Michael at this point here to tell us perhaps what your feelings of Tapu Tapu Atea mean for you, but also how you kind of then stumbled upon this European called Sydney Parkinson.
Well, going back to, like I said, my relations put me on a boat from Tahiti to Tapu Atea. I didn't even know where we were going. And basically, I turned up at the marae. And everything just sort of fell into place. I'm just telling it from a personal point of view. I was just discovering some family I didn't know. And then in The Trial of the Cannibal Dog, there's this character called Tupaia, and also Parkinson, this young gentleman, who I actually started to fall in love with because he was doing this collab with Tupaia, creating this first watercolour. And for me, that was the first real collab, and I felt that was my pull to illustrate and go to those spots where these guys actually collab together and shared that watercolour. So when Tupaia appeared in the book, there was this, I don't know, it was a calling, everything started to fall into place. So, and I spent a lot of my childhood being ashamed of myself because of the racism that was going on in Aotearoa. But for the first time in my life, I could find a superhero that I could actually relate to. I could feel better about myself because he was a star navigator, he was a translator, he was the in-between guy, but also he was an artist, an arohui. And then there was this young gentleman, Parkinson, Sydney Parkinson, and I was trying to put myself in that position, going to these spots where they actually created these illustrations. Without these illustrations, we wouldn't have any recording of like what was it like at that period, and even the waka that were actually sketched. So for me, it's a good sad ending for the two gentlemen, Tupaia and Tioto and Parkinson, when they ended up in Batavia. And for me, I was always lamenting Parkinson because there was all these visual diaries or visual images that were created on that journey. And he never got to go home, but his brother received the images. And for me, that's where I sort of went down that line instead of going to... I went to, Joseph Banks, and there was Cookie, and there was Solander, but it was Parkinson I was more attracted to where he went. So I tried to actually just try to put in their feet, put my head in that space. But the marae was, when I went back there when we were doing some filming on the Tupaia's Endeavour, and again, it was all these things, just coincidence, just keep happening. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how does Tupaia, who was from Tapu Tapu Atea or nearby originally, how he came to be involved in the Endeavour voyage?
That's a really good discussion, because since that film, we created that film, I say the narrative or some of the stories have changed. There's some brilliant, interesting podcasts out there about whether he was nicked or he was forced onto the boat, or whether he voluntarily went onto the boat. So there is some really good discussions, and if you have the chance, go and listen to some really tense, interesting podcasts, because it's being discussed amongst our community. So for me, I'm excited about now all these stories are coming out, and now we've got a chance to actually talk about it and actually question the narrative and how he got onto the boat and whether he betrayed the people, and whether he was a traitor. I've heard that one, and then there's also he voluntarily went on. So there's several different angles looking at it from that point of view.
Yeah. I've just put up your picture. This is Michael's image of Parkinson. Do you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, he's my beautiful gentleman. Look, he's got the kakapiq. That was the first illustration. You see this beautiful watercolour of the kakapiq. It was in full bloom at that time when they arrived at Tolika Bay, and this is in this spot, in this very particular spot. It's in Oputama, and there's a cave. This is in Aotearoa called Tupaia's Cave. And the reason why I've used Parkinson as part of that scene there, it was the first time I actually... there's a very famous image of the kura, or the crayfish, being traded with Joseph Banks. And that was actually Tupaia doing the illustration. So for me, I got overexcited, but then going to the actual spot and actually see where the actual image was conceived, and then also looking at where Tupaia's Cave was. Yeah, I was just going on this massive journey trying to track where they created these illustrations. And so the carving that you're looking at, the mouth of it, is from Puera. It was a carving that lives in Tobigam. It made its journey back in the Tuia 250 for the first time, back to the Hauiti. So I was just trying to figure out layers and actually how these all these layers of events actually happened. I mean, even going to the opposite side on the right side, where the kura and taru were growing, and up there was the great theatre, I call it the great theatre, where Tupaia had this massive discussions with the locals. Yeah, where they were just collecting water as well from the Endeavour. Yeah. So when Tuia 250 happened,
which is 2019, the New Zealand commemoration of the Endeavour.
The dream came true, and there's some images that it was just when Haunui came into Oputama, the whole thing just came together. From Anne's translations and putting all the words, the book together. And all I was constantly doing was just dissecting the book and questioning it and asking those questions myself. And with the film crew, and then there was a tag that Tupaia had actually left in the cave. It's up there, so we were questioning it.
We're going to get to that tag in a minute.
Sorry,
that's all right. That's good. But so as Michael mentioned, Tupaia was also an artist. We don't have the crayfish image that he just mentioned, but we do have. Here's one of them, where we can see Tupaia giving us evidence now of waka in Tahiti.
Yeah, and this is where the first collab actually happens. I mean, here's Sydney Parkinson fighting all the flies, eating all his paper. He's under the net. Most of you sail, and when you basically all the mosquitoes are eating your head. So, but at the same time, there's this curiosity from Tupaia, like him creating these images. And so this is Tupaia taking the very first step of using a European medium. So it's like taking the very first photograph, to put it quite simply. Yeah.
And do you want to jump in here and tell us a little more about Tupaia that you wanted to add? While Anne talks, I'm going to give you Michael's beautiful, this is his imagery of Parkinson and Tupaia working together to produce possibly, or to think about the Tupaia's production of the previous image.
Well, maybe just to explain a little bit about how I came to write about Cook's Voyages, because what happened was, having gone to the anthropology department at the University of Auckland, wanting to study te reo, but at the same time I was really blessed, and I met Edwina Sterling, Armedia Sterling. I had these mentors, and they took me on a journey over 20 years, and sleeping in marae, listening to the old people talk, tell the stories that Hotu would have heard, with the ancestor carvings sort of behind us, and hearing the stories of the ancestors arriving and so on. And I began to realise that in my own country, which I thought I knew, there was this other whole world. You know, the place names were different, the stories were different. And so when I started, what happened was Eruera and Armedia, we did 3 books together, and then I went to Cambridge, and in the very early 80s they both died. And I had to then rethink everything I was doing as a scholar. And for some reason, I think it was being in Cambridge as well, where there's a big Cook collection, I decided I would try and figure out how this relationship began. And so I started looking at voyages and the very, very early accounts. And of course, immediately and very quickly came to the amazing accounts of eyewitness accounts on board Endeavour. So, and I guess I had an ancestral link through my great-grandfather. My grandfather used to talk about Cook a lot. And so I got curious and I started reading the logs and journals. But for me, as a historian, most people had written about it from the vantage point of on board the ship. But I because of, the people on the shore were real for me, because I'd sort of slept underneath their carvings, I'd heard the stories. And so I was really curious to know what was happening on shore and who the people were. And so when we started looking at Tahiti, that was just a revelation. And I loved starting to meet voyagers when I was starting to do that work, because at that point, people like Herb Carne, Ben Finney, they were beginning this thing of the great renaissance of showing people that these voyages are possible, you can do it. And it was Herb that first talked to me about Tupaia, and Herb Carne, who was a great Hawaiian artist, but also one of the people that kicked off this whole voyaging renaissance. And so Tupaia, high priest navigator, as you say, Arioi, the Arioi were they were based at Tapitapoatea. It was a great voyaging marae. They were the followers of Oro, who was the god of fertility and war, the kind of death and life. And they were taking that belief and that atua, that akua, out to different parts of they were sailing, they were navigators. And Tupaia was trained as a high priest navigator and an artist. They were artists, they were actors actually, they did all sorts, they were amazing, amazing people, the Arioi. And so when I started reading the journals and the logs, and I was able to read the originals, it was extraordinary, sitting in queue and with these logs from the voyages in my hands. And so I noticed Tupaia and became very curious about him, because I'd heard about him from Herb, who was a navigator and a voyager. And so there was Tupaia, and it was obvious that he was pivotal. He was this very important figure in Tahitian history at that time. He had been driven out of his own island, Ra'iatea. The Bora Bora warriors had conquered that island, and he escaped with the young high chief and took to Tahiti into exile. And there he became the high priest for Pūrea and her lover as well, as you do in those days. And they tried to set her son as the high chief of the ari'i of the whole island, and he was defeated just before the Endeavour arrived. So here's this artist, navigator, somebody that knew the stars, and there was the Endeavour. They set up their observatory. They were looking at the stars. They had the artist, Sidney Parkinson, and he forged a relationship with Joseph Banks, in particular, I think, as well as Parkinson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's Tupaia, and he attached himself to that party, and then eventually, of course, sailed with them and helped to pilot them, the ship. And what an act of trust by Cook, because he only had one vessel. And Tupaia actually piloted the ship through the Society Islands and took them to Tapitapoatea. Yeah. So it's an extraordinary story.
It is. And so we know that Tupaia managed to go to Aotearoa. He also went to the east coast of Australia on the Endeavour. But this is one of, there are about 10 sketches, pictorial sketches. Michael tells a beautiful story about, looking at them in London. But this is probably the most extraordinary archival bit that Tupaia has left us, which is his mapping of the Pacific Islands that he knew, either by visiting or through knowledge that he'd earned, which he also then shares with, and there's another, I'll just put this straight on to another beautiful imagining by Michael in Cook's cabin. And here's Tupaia saying, this is how I think the cartography pans out. And then I think this is Cook, isn't it? Looking up with the big face saying, yeah, that pretty much matches exactly what we've just been discovering as well, which I think really does put a bit of, thought on this word discovery. And I think maybe that's when Cook's also discovering that the word is perhaps not the most apt. So I loved it. I hadn't seen this one before today of Michael's imagining, but the previous map, so solidifying of this idea of this is Tupaia being the expert before the arrival of Endeavour. Hotu, I want to just, before we move on again, just ask you, particularly the map of Tupaia and some of the images of waka that he draws, is this resonant for you? Has this been part of your understanding of the big story?
That map of Tupaia's was actually a focus of quite a lot of discussion during the 250 voyage around Aotearoa, and we had a couple of people who'd been researching it and trying to figure out why Tupaia's way of putting all his islands down on a piece of paper looks so different to the kind of map that everybody else was used to looking at. At the end of the day, I think you need to be able to understand a Polynesian or a Pacific Island way of thinking to be able to figure all this kind of stuff out. And it's around the idea of knowing that often your waka or your vessel is the point of reference, and that you're looking at we're looking at where something is from our canoe. And so it's a little bit different than standing on one point on land and then starting to figure out where everything else is. So it's quite a lot of good discussion about that. The other thing that I like about all those old paintings is that those styles of canoe that you see painted, especially there's one image there that had a whole bunch of canoes in the bay, and a lot of the imagery in terms of paintings and things like that people have conjured up at home with how they think our ancestors arrived in Aotearoa. There are all these images of waka that really are waka that were developed once they got to Aotearoa. But as I was looking at canoe design and looking at the kinds of things that I thought the stories that my ancestors or that my grandparents told me about where my ancestors came from, I started looking at specific types of canoes in places like Tahiti, Raiatea, in the Tuamotus, because my stories, and even part of our language, talks about coming from places like that. And when I've travelled there, people from those places know some of the very old stories that I know that I've been told a long, long time ago. So one thing that we're quite fortunate about, and there's actually a book called Canoes of Oceania where they've got all these old drawings where some of the earliest explorers, when they travelled through the Pacific, they drew these really detailed drawings, measurements and everything of some of the old canoes that people were still sailing around and doing long trips on. And fortunately for us, that in the early 90s, Sir Tom Davis, he built a waka in the Cook Islands based upon some of these old drawings. And we ended up building a canoe exactly like that, and the shapes of all of those canoes are really, really close to the shapes of the canoes that you see in those drawings. And I've got a small what we did was we built a small 10-metre one first to just see what this was like, and we'd sail it around and tested it all out, tested it with the high aspect sails and all of those kinds of things. And that translated into, and we will have an image later on of the big voyaging canoes that we've been sailing all over the place now. And so for me, I think it's really important to see all those old images, because it validates for me the kinds of things that I was told about, and it helped me to break free of the, I guess, colonised images that were created in Aotearoa to show the way or the types of canoes that my ancestors sailed in. And to be able to build these, and I get challenged by, I got challenged by some of the elders at home saying, that doesn't look like a canoe. That's a catamaran, that kind of talk. And I keep saying to them, well, these canoes are these are the ancestors of modern day catamarans that we know today. And and even if any of you have been watching the Sail GP boats that race, I have a really good relationship with all those guys, and we sit and we talk about how these foiling catamarans that they sail now are the great grand descendants of these vessels that sailed serious distances across the ocean so long ago.
Fantastic. I'm just going to go slightly off script just for a minute, just because I know that all three people here have mentioned Tuia 250, which was, as I said before, the 2019 New Zealand kind of celebration or commemoration of the Endeavour arrival. If you recall, in this country, we were going to have our 2020 version, which went haywire through various circumstances. But all three of you were heavily involved in the 250 celebrations or moments in New Zealand. I was wondering if you could each talk about the role that you had concerning waka, concerning cook, and concerning tupaia, actually, for that moment. Anne, do you want to start us off?
Well, Hotu and I were both on the organising committee for the national commemoration, but I'm also from Gisborne, so I was pretty involved at home as well, because that was the first place where Endeavour landed when they arrived in Aotearoa. And of course, there was a lot of angst, because people were, the whole story about Cook discovering New Zealand, this idea that somehow or other, he'd arrived at a place that was kind of empty, and we all knew that wasn't true, but there were still some people that held fast to those kinds of ideas, and so the idea that the Endeavour had brought, the first intimations of what became a colonial process that was very painful, and particularly at home when the Endeavour came in. Originally, the very first encounter, there was a clash. Cook had gone ashore with some of his companions, and he'd crossed the river that I grew up on, actually. He'd crossed the river with his companions. He'd left some young boys guarding the boat, and a small boat that they'd brought ashore, and some warriors came down from the hill that I grew up, Titirangi it's called, and they came down the hill with their spears. They had spears, and they did a werawa challenge. And the boys panicked. They thought they were being attacked. It was almost certainly a ritual challenge. Who are you? What are you? Where have you come from? Because the stories from home say when they first saw the Endeavour, they had no idea what it was. They thought it was a floating island. They thought it was, a great bird, maybe, some of them. And so they just didn't know. And then these creatures turn up on the beach. And so they sent out challenges, as you always do with strangers. And one of them pulled back the spear to throw it, and which you did do too in the old days. You'd parry it. And the coxswain saw this, and he shot this man dead. And no one had seen guns before. So, and then there were some other shootings that happened out in the bay, and these memories are still very vivid at home. I know all the descendants of Te Maro. He was the first man that got shot. You know, I know the descendants of Te Rākau. I know the stories about the boys out in the bay that got kidnapped and taken on board the Endeavour. And so people were, the feeling was, it was painful. But, so what happened was, the Endeavour had come before, which was really interesting. But when we had our meetings with this big group, nobody wanted to perpetuate the story of Cook discovering New Zealand. And it became very, very important that the story of the Voyaging waka, because exactly where Cook landed actually had been a landing site for waka before that. Some of the great voyaging waka that brought the ancestors to our part of the country, Te Rāwhiti, had landed there before. And so Hoturoa was deeply involved in those discussions. We had the Prime Minister. She was our minister. She was the Minister of Culture and Heritage. Quite nervous about it all. But then Hoturoa and the others said, well, we will have a fleet of voyaging waka and we'll look after the Endeavour. So we'll take her in. We'll go in first because that's how it happened. and then we'll look after. So it was an extraordinary series of events, really, for the whole country, I think. Yeah. People were nervous about it, but it turned into something amazing.
Before we get to Hotu's role in it, I'll move to some of the slides that Michael has given us. Also, here's still some 18th century waka images. But here, Michael, do you want to talk us through? You were present?
So we're at Tolika Bay and Opotama in the valley. So after, as you said, they had the riff-raff going on down there with the shooting. And you got to remember, Tupaia was actually still on the boat when that first incident actually happened.
Yes, he
they
wasn't
never brought him ashore.
Yep, that's true.
So when he came ashore, all of a sudden, when he broke out in his linguistics, all of a sudden, everyone started listening. So again, what we're looking at here is Tupaia's cave up in Tolika Bay, further up. And again, this is another dream come true. It's like, like I said before, when the book was released, when we were talking about Trial of the Kingdom of Dog, and I dived really hard, all these things were coming to me. And these people were actually from Tahiti, from Whawhiete.
Yeah.
And I always had this dream about them coming back to Tupaia's cave. And what happened? They were climbing up towards Tupaia's cave. And at the top of it, as I was saying before, he left his tag up there, Aitu, at the top. And for me, it's a really significant shot, and we spent a lot of time looking for this tag. I didn't find the tag at first when we started filming and doing the research, and all of a sudden this image actually appeared. So there's been a lot of discussion about this particular piece. I don't know why it's not being protected. That's not my area of expertise. But again, for me, it was really significant. And when Whawhiete turned up at Tuia 250, for me, it was like reacquaintance with the whānau, or family getting back together again. Yeah.
For the other...
Yeah, and you got Honui, and again, a dream come true, coming into the bay. You know, and this is, like I was saying before, when Sydney and Tupaia and all this interaction was going just in this small valley. And so... when the Tuia 250 happened, this all just fell into place as you looked at the painting. So I was just I was in my element, but at the same time very nervous at that time when it actually all happened, because there was tension, but we needed that to order to step forward in a positive direction, because there was all these different narratives and stories being challenged about what actually happened, and it's still going on.
I think the next ones are, yes, they're repeating some of the Michael's kind of engagement with this 250-year-old story. But this image brings us back to Hotu. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what was it like to be part of that moment in the Tuia 250, and then something broader about what this image is for you?
Actually, Tuia 250 was very challenging. Originally, the New Zealand government wanted to call it the endeavour and cook celebration.
Yes.
So it was very, very challenging, and I'd been invited to some meetings in Wellington where at the very first meeting they said, "Oh, do you think you'd be interested in sailing your canoes in when the Endeavour sails into these places around New Zealand?" And that meeting, there were a number of the different captains and navigators of the various canoes that we have in New Zealand, and they all looked at me. And I turned around to the people from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage and said, "If this is a celebration where we, as the original people who arrived here on our vessels, are just the cheerleading party, we're not going to do it. If you're going to do something like this, you need to be able to talk to the whole country about how Aotearoa New Zealand was populated by people, not just by my ancestors from the Pacific, but leading right through up until today." And so what ended up happening, the Ministry of Culture and Heritage had to go away. We had a few more meetings, and then they said, "Well, why don't we call it Tuia 250 that talks about how our nation is populated by people who have come from everyone who's come to New Zealand has come from somewhere else, and that the fabric that weaves us together is the fact that we have all come from a place far away across the ocean." And so that's why they ended up calling it Tuia 250, because Tuia means to sew things together. And so I said to them, "Well, if we're going to do this, the canoes will always be the first vessels that will land at any of these places. And the Endeavour can travel to places that that Captain Cook might have sailed to, but there will be places of great significance along the coastline for a number of different tribal groups in Aotearoa where we will land these canoes. And if the Endeavour wants to come with us, they can. If they want to keep on and then meet us at our next destination where the Endeavour travelled during Captain Cook's time, we can do that." It worked out for us because we could always stop places and catch them up. We'd stop places, for a little bit, engage with the people there, then we'd just go and then catch them up again. And so I think the important thing about that is that it reiterates the kind of things that he wrote in his logs about how the native canoes could sail circles around his ship. And so we were able to do these kind of things, and as Anne said, I think the arrival of the waka first in some of these places was very helpful in settling some of the anxiety that a lot of the local tribal groups had about all the other things that they associated with his arrival back in 1769. But this image up here actually comes from my hometown. There's a small coastal town. There's most of the time there's only about 450 people who live there. Summertime you get up to about 5,000 or 6,000 people that'll come. But you can see this is a big rock. There's another one further down at the other end of the fence, and these rocks mark the final resting place of the canoe that brought my ancestors to New Zealand. And so, in this harbour, we have all these places. There's these big old trees along the coastline that all have names because when the people came, these were trees that the canoe was moored to, and all these kinds of stories that we have. So you can see why it's quite challenging for me as a kid going to school, listening to people tell me that the journeys that my ancestors made were just a stroke of luck. And then I live in a place like this, or I come from a place like this, where there's this very rich background of all the kinds of things that my ancestors did. There's old gardens where there's taro, there's old places where taro is still growing that was brought on the canoe 600 years ago. And all these different kinds of things that always remind us and tell us that these journeys of our ancestors were real. And so the next picture will actually show you, this is out on that harbour. So one of the things that I get into is actually sailing around the harbour and looking at a lot of the historic sites that were settled by those original first settlers. And that's one of our canoes that we have in our little fleet of waka that we sail around Aotearoa. That's the waka that we sailed right up onto the beach in that other picture where Tupaia's cave was. I think it's this whole idea of taking young people out on, it's not just about going on long distance voyages and sailing to islands far across the sea. For us, one of our other big jobs is sailing around our own land and going to places where they've had traditions of ancestral arrivals on canoes.
Yeah.
Because what that does is it sparks the memories of a lot of people who until then were afraid to talk about the voyaging history and traditions of their ancestors for fear of being laughed at.
Yeah.
And just one of the great things that I found sailing around New Zealand, we've sailed around the North Island, I don't know how many times. We sailed all the way down to Stewart Island, right down the bottom of the South Island and back up, doing programs with school kids, doing programs with different coastal communities. Not just doing cultural programs, but doing programs where we try to introduce them to science and marine, I guess, care and all those other things that's really important for us. This is one of the groups of kids that we've been doing. We've got two programs called Kura Waiti and Kura Waita. This is the Kura Waita group. And Waiti and Waita are two stars in we call it Matariki constellation, Pleiades. And Waiti are the stars that have a particular connection to fresh water. And freshwater food, freshwater activities. And then Waita has a particular connection to salt water. So all our programs that we do with young people in the ocean is Kura Waita. And then we have programs that we do with schools and young people on freshwater, on rivers and lakes and things like that. And the next slide is it's our Kura Wai tea program. So we've got all this kind of stuff happening with all our kids, trying to get them to, I guess it's getting them to understand that their ancestors were mathematicians.
Yeah.
They were scientists. They were astronomers. They were great naval architects. They were great navigators. They were great healers. They were great guardians of the things that were important to them. And so we can instill our young people with those kinds of knowledge. Our role's a little bit different now. It's not about finding new land. It's not about sailing to find a new home for us to stay at, but how do we use our canoes now to look for sustainability, to look for ways to show and teach our communities what are the things that we can do together to look after ourselves. And it's pretty good. We're lucky we get a little bit of help from different groups to be able to do this kind of thing. But it's a very, very time-consuming, but it's quite rewarding when we see some of the things that these young people do. It's not just about sailing far, far away. It's about sailing close as well and sharing those kinds of things with our people. One of the things that we actually started doing since that 2-year 250 program is that we created this commitment to have these, every 2 years, to have these big canoe festivals. It's a bit like the Wooden Boat Festival, but smaller. Where we'll sail maybe 5 or 6 of our big voyaging canoes will come to a community, and then all the small canoe builders will bring all their canoes, and we'll spend a week there. And we do it all around the country. We do it in a East Coast, West Coast, South Island kind of triangle. And this is in Kaiteriteriti, which is in Golden Bay, in the top of the South Island. And this is during the opening ceremony when we had a little parade of all the canoes that sailed in to support that program. And it's a way for us to try and spread the word. It's like us being here today talking about Pacific voyaging and travelling, the travelling of our ancestors. It's a bit like this in Aotearoa, is that we need to travel to places to talk about this kind of thing, because often people have either never heard about it or haven't heard things from our point of view sometimes. So these kinds of gatherings are quite important.
I'll just jump in there because you were talking so much about young people and kind of, I guess, your relationship with young people and thinking about what you feel obliged to. And it did just remind me of the great Tongan intellectual, Epeli Hauafa, who wrote a book called We Are the Ocean, which is the name of this panel is in tribute to Hauafa's ideas. And I just wanted to read out just a little bit from what Hauafa wrote nearly 30 years ago now, about in a book called We Are the Ocean. What was interesting to me is that he was inspired to write this because he was in a University of South Pacific looking at young people and seeing the disappointments on their faces when kind of old negative histories or stories are told to them. And he felt obliged to kind of retell a story, reimagine the history so that this disappointment didn't come back at him. So this is just some words from Hauafa that I wanted to read out. This is from 1993. The idea that the Pacific Islands are too small, too poor, and too isolated to develop any meaningful degree of autonomy is a geographic deterministic view of a very narrow kind that overlooks cultural history. If we look at the myths, legends, and oral traditions of the peoples of Oceania, it becomes evident that they did not conceive of their world in such microscopic proportions. Their universe comprised the surrounding ocean as far as they could traverse. They thought big and recounted their deeds in epic proportions. So very kind of resonant words for, generations that I know of across the Pacific, and clearly was quite resonant for the people who came up with the title for this panel. I thought maybe we've only got a few minutes more before we open up to questions. Might start with Hotu, go to Anne, and then end with Michael about what Hauafa's vision or words mean to you personally and your work.
For me, it's the kind of talk that tells us to think big, and thinking big is looking at what's past not the near horizon, but the far horizon, which is exactly what our ancestors tried to do. And see, I don't know if he's here, but when we flew over, one of the passengers sitting next to me, Grant, we were having a good talk actually, and he asked me, these people, when they got on their canoes and they sailed away, they don't even know if land's there. I said, well, actually you do. If you sit down and you watch nature, there's these birds that live in a forest because they live in a forest in your little island. And at a certain time of year, they all go and take off, and they take off in one direction. So even though you can't see it, logic tells you that somewhere in that direction there's got to be another forest. There's got to be some land there. And so what you do is you start these voyages, you think big and think there's something there, I'm going to go and have a look. And you start doing these epic voyages of discovery just to see and do a bit of exploration and to see what you can find. And you actually get there, then you go back and say to people, there's actually some place down there and this is how you get to it. You can't do that without thinking big. without knowing that you can do great things. You know, I always say to these young people, you didn't get here because your ancestors were mediocre. You know, you got here because your ancestors were clever, they were tough, and they knew what they were doing. And you do them a disservice when you sit down and you don't try to do stuff.
Yeah.
And you must have known of Hoafa for the last 30 plus years and his words. What do they mean to you in your work?
I think the thing about Apeli and his vision of the ocean, that idea that the sea is a place where you can be at home, and that the people that traverse the ocean, you know, they have these great wide views. I mean, I've loved meeting up with the Voyaging community, because the people that go out there and sail and do those journeys, they don't have a small mind. They don't have small minds. The thing that's troubling in a way, I mean, I'm just going to quote back to you. I want to read from Cook, because I saw the Endeavour out there today. And Cook, in those communications with Tupaia, navigator to navigator, sailor to sailor, you know, deep sea sailor to deep sea sailor, he figured out what the scientists have had to rediscover. And he said, way back then, in Raiatea, he said, in these pahi, these people sailed in those seas from island to island for hundreds of leagues, the sun serving them for a compass by day and the moon and the stars by night. When this comes to be proved, we shall no longer be at a loss to know how those islands lying in those seas came to be peopled. For if the inhabitants of Raiatea have been at islands laying 200 or 300 leagues to the west, it cannot be doubted but the inhabitants of those western islands may have been at others, as far to the west of them, and so we may trace them from island to island, quite to the East Indies. And the fact that Cook, in direct communication with Tupaia, these deep-sea navigators, worked that out way back then, back in the 18th century. And then you had scholars, people like Andrew Sharp and others, that said, oh no, this can't have been possible. These people must have staggered ashore. They must have been caught in storms. They didn't have the capacity to do this. You know, and then the scientists had to go about and prove them wrong through science, and Hoturoa and Herb have had to prove them wrong by actually showing you can do it again today. You know, I think we need the vision of the great ocean. You know, we need to be able to see wide and far, and we need to look to far horizons. I think in navigating our futures, we need relationships that are close. We need to be able to talk in New Zealand right at this very minute about Te Tiriti. You know, we need to be able to discuss these matters person to person, face to face. And in that way, we can have the kind of future that Hotu's talking about. You know, we could have our kids be willing to go out there and explore, take on the world, know that the sea is a home. It's not a strange and terrifying place. And be the kind of people that look to the far horizon.
Michael, could I give the last word to you about what Hoafa's vision and your other predecessors' vision of kind of reimagining the Pacific has meant to you?
I'm just sort of really envious of my grandchildren and my own kids, because now it's normalised to speak your language at home. And actually I'm really envious because it's now it's coming the norm. You know, and you got these crazy, I don't know, and I'm going to go off the track here. You've got that crazy movie, Moana, and all that sort of carrying on. It's all about just the confidence, feeling good about yourself. Because like I said before, not just me, but a lot of the young men, I became really concerned about our young men with the suicide rate being so high, trying to look for vehicles to make them feel good about themselves. So in Hotu and Anne and all these other amazing people start to create these great projects, you can start feeling good about yourself. And if we got these vehicles at home that can actually make you feel better, and I just felt that these were opportunities to now stop walking around with your head down, but feeling you can actually lift your head up and actually realise that our linguistics, our mathematics, our science, and everything has a synergy. Down to the moon cycles, it all makes sense. And if we can just... So I've spent most of my lifetime trying to figure out different vehicles or different ways of mental well-being. Just like we're doing the exercise here, I talk about mental well-being with the just colouring in crayons, on the UPT blocks that we're doing over there. But just an opportunity to give your headspace a break. So I just felt when I started going on the cookie journey, or Tupaya journey, or Parkinson, I started feeling really mentally good about myself. So if I feel good about myself, then everybody else will start, sharing with people. Because I became very concerned about the high incarceration rates we've got back at home, and looking for something that actually can see some light. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and actually looking at the past, and actually looking at these navigators, these amazing people. So for me, it's a positive direction. But I'm very envious of my grandkids, because now they've got the freedom to feel good about themselves. Yeah. And that's what makes me excited about being at home in Aotearoa.
Fantastic. We've just got a touch over time, which is eaten into your question time, but we do have a little bit of question time. We don't have mics, so I'm going to get you to stand up if that's okay. But over here, yes. So I'll just try and recap the question. The question is mostly focused on knowing that there's been a Aotearoa Norfolk Island traffic in the past, which brings up the question, was there Pacific arrivals on the east coast of Australia, before the Endeavour? Do any of you want to put your hand up to answer that? I do know that it is at the level of kind of speculation, but archaeologists are working quite hard at it, aren't they? Any comments?
I guess I've got a little bit to comment on, because we've actually sailed up to Norfolk Island a few times, really for training navigation. And I've been to the Polynesian settlement site that's been there, and I've spent quite a bit of time with everybody up there. I'm not 100% sure of where those first Polynesians that inhabited the island came from. I'd always thought, because they used to have these big giant trees and things like that over there, I thought, and this is just me, I thought this is kind of like a little, like a Bunnings or a Mitre 10 that you'd sail over, you'd sail there too. You go, oh, here we go, we'll get some of these trees and build ourselves a waka, and we'll take off again and cruise around and do something like that. But I actually haven't had in our canoe history about my ancestors. All we've ever talked about is where we've come from, and that once we got to Aotearoa, to New Zealand, the travel was more internal and across the land. So I really haven't heard any stories of any of my ancestors coming across this way. But I don't think it's impossible. It's just I haven't heard the story. It might be like what it is now. They came here and they liked it so much they don't come home again.
Can I get another question? Okay, I've got a question down here, and then maybe just one or two afterwards. Yeah.
I have a Hawaiian friend.
Right, here's a question. Was hula dancing introduced to Hawaii from Tahiti? Does anyone on our panel know?
Well, if that ancestor's name was Laka, then it was that ancestor. It did introduce dance to Hawaii, but that was probably 1,000 years ago or more.
Yeah. One of those arrows that went from the Tahitian archipelago up to Hawaii in that movement. Great. Question over here. I think there's one hand here first. Would you like to stand up? I'm going to ask Anne or Michael to answer how far along are we in, at least in Aotearoa about changing some names like Poverty Bay to original names.
Well, I'm from there. I think quite a long way along. Quite often what happens is dual names, and so they kind of say, okay, well, we'll... But then everyone gets used to the Māori name, and then everyone starts using that, like Taranaki, for example, for Mount Egmont. I mean, it was Mount Egmont for years and years and years, and then they renamed it Taranaki, but left Mount Egmont there, and then people just got used to calling it Taranaki. And I think that's just the way they do it. It's rather than sort of making a forcible imposition, give people the choice, and then they just migrate into te reo.
I think it just comes the norm. I mean, I was at that period when they changed it from Mount Egmont to Taranaki, and it was very tense because that's where my feeding father's from Balblog. And I remember when they changed the name, it was just very tense. But now, as I said before with my grandkids, it's just going to come the norm. Like in Potoni, going back to the original names, and it does have a holistic view. It does make sense when you start to actually break the names down and you start to look at the landscape, how the name came about. So again, there's this new generation that will come normalised, but then there's the old generation who's still stuck in their ways. And that's okay, because the younger ones are going to come, and that's just coming normalised, as I said before.
One question here, and then probably could take one if there's a hand up there later. But yeah, question here.
Kontiki, is it debunked?
That's
They came from South America. Was it colonisation?
Right, so here is question, is the Kontiki theory debunked? We might go to Anne first and then have some other reflections.
Yeah, they've done quite a lot of archaeological work.
Can you say what the theory is?
Oh, this is the theory. The theory is Thor Heyerdahl thought that perhaps South Americans had come to Easter Island because there were these amazing megaliths, and he didn't think that Polynesians, it's a bit like the Voyaging story, didn't think Polynesians could have built them, and so he thought they must have come from the great stone pyramid building traditions in South America. But it's almost certain, I think, absolutely certain, that it was Polynesians that just kept going all the way to South America and found the kumara there, and they found Polynesian chicken bones in excavations there, and they've got a bit of DNA as well. So it looks as though what happened was that the voyaging, the Hoturoa types, they didn't stop. They just went from Easter Island and went all the way to South America, found the kumara, brought it back, and then reintroduced it right across the Pacific.
Is there a question up the top layer that I can't see quite well? Yes, there's one right up here. Yes, here we go.
How did the waka find remote islands, isolated islands?
Here's a question about navigation. How did the waka find the very remote places?
I think those of you who've been sailing would probably recognise these techniques as well, but generally birds are really good signs. Okay, you get these birds and if you know your birds, there's birds that, so if you sail along and you see an albatross, you go, I'm not going to follow that bird, but there's certain birds that have a range from shore out to sea to go fishing, and usually they'll fly out in the morning. Maybe they'll and then in the evening they'll get, or after they've done their day out fishing, they'll fly home. And often you'll see these birds before you see land. So, for instance, my last big trip, we sailed to Rarotonga from New Zealand. After about 12 days, I said to my gang, start looking for these birds, because we've sailed enough time now that we should be able to start seeing these birds. They'll be coming towards us either from, they could be coming from different directions, but they'll be coming towards us. Or they'll be flying away from us. So you just need to figure out what time of day we're looking and seeing these kind of things. So there's those things to watch out for. There's things like frigate birds, which fly really, really high. You can see them from quite a long way away without seeing the island. The colour of clouds can tell you where there's shallow water in a lagoon that could be far, far away. It's really, really easy to see these kinds of signs in places like Aitutaki, Bora Bora, places with these very big shallow lagoons where the water's a different colour to the deep sea water, and that colour is reflected up as loom underneath clouds on a really nice day. So there's a whole lot of stuff like that that becomes a part of your repertoire of signs to look for. And if you know how far you've been travelling and how many days you've been going along your course, you know when to start looking for these things and getting the rest of your crew to keep an eye out for them. One time we were sailing up towards Nukuhiva, and we left a small island called Whakarava, and we were sailing to Nukuhiva, and we'd been sailing for about 6-7 days, and then I just said to our gang, you got to look out this. By this afternoon, you're going to see a small rock, a rock poking up out of the sea. When you see that, I told them which direction to sail in, and then we'll do another night and we'll get to this island. And I don't know, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, someone was sitting and they yelled out, I think there's that rock. And so I said, good, because now we'll only be about a day or so away. I can have a rest, turn the canoe that way and just sail that way through the night, and you should see the island in the morning. And and we had a few people on there who'd never sort of experienced that kind of way of navigating before. And they're going, because we had a bit of a talk about it afterwards. They said to me, how did you feel when they saw that rock that you told them to keep an eye out for? And I said, relief, probably, that was where I thought it was supposed to be. But I think, really there's a lot of these natural signs like birds and clouds and all. Those are the kind of things that will help you find it. And a lot of you who are experienced ocean travellers, you would have seen all that kind of stuff anyway.
Because I think I'm going to have to wrap it up, because I believe we've got one more performance at the end. So I'm going to now ask you to join with me in thanking our wonderful panellists so much. Thank you. Well done.